She taught the world what a champion looks like. Not the polished, pedigreed kind that tennis had always produced. Born into country clubs, coached from infancy, handed rackets the way other children are handed toys. The kind who emerges from somewhere the sport never expected. From cracked asphalt and chain-link fences. From a neighborhood where the sound of gunfire was more familiar than the pop of a tennis ball. She didn't just win. She rewrote the definition of winning. 23 Grand Slam titles. The most by any player in the Open era. A body that redefined what the human form could accomplish on a court. A presence so commanding that even her opponents admitted, before the match began, that something inside them had already surrendered. And then, quietly, without a trophy ceremony or a final triumphant serve, Serena Williams walked away. Not beaten. Not broken in the way the world understands breaking. But changed in ways she is still, even now, in the silence that follows an extraordinary life, trying to fully name. What does it cost to be the greatest? Not in the abstract, philosophical sense that motivates speeches and motivational posters. In the actual, physical, private sense, the surgeries, the diagnoses, the moments on hospital beds when the woman who had defeated every opponent the sport could produce lay completely powerless against her own body. What does it cost to carry a sport that never fully wanted you on its shoulders for 3 decades and smile at the camera while doing it? What do you become when the thing that defined you since you were 4 years old is no longer yours to hold? Before we answer those questions, we need to go back. Back before the trophies and the magazine covers and the cultural iconography. Back to the place where this story truly begins. A city that most people in tennis never had to think about. And a girl who would one day make it impossible for them to look away. Compton, California. In 1981, the year Serena Jamaica Williams was born on September 26th, Compton was a city already famous for the wrong reasons. Unemployment, gang violence, poverty compressed into neighborhoods where ambition had to survive in conditions that strangled it. The Williams household at that time contained Richard Williams, a self-made man of enormous vision and enormous contradiction, his wife Oracene Price, and a family that would eventually number 5 daughters: Yetunde, Isha, Lindria, Venus, and then Serena, the youngest. The last. The one who would end up carrying the weight of the entire experiment her father had already designed before she was born. Richard Williams had written a plan. Not a vague aspiration. Not a parental hope. A 78-page plan for producing 2 tennis champions from daughters who did not yet exist. He had watched Virginia Ruzici win a professional tennis tournament on television, seen the check she received, and concluded with the particular logic of a man who had survived poverty through sheer will that tennis was the path. He taught himself the game from videotapes. He learned enough to teach his wife, and then, on the cracked public courts of Compton, surrounded by the evidence that the world had already decided this neighborhood did not matter, he began to teach his daughters. There were no ball machines, no coaching academies, no access to the facilities that produced the players Serena would one day defeat. There were chain-link fences, broken glass on the courts that had to be swept before practice could begin, and a father who stood on the baseline with the unshakable certainty that what he was building would change everything. Local gang members sometimes watched practice. Richard Williams would speak to them, acknowledge them, incorporate them into the ecosystem of his daughter's preparation with the ease of a man who understood that belonging meant something different in Compton than it did anywhere else in the tennis world. Serena watched Venus first. Always Venus first. Her older sister was the one the plan had centered on initially, and from the beginning, Venus was the one who drew the attention, the whispers, the early predictions. Serena came behind her in every drill, every practice, every early tournament, the younger, rounder, louder of the two. Where Venus was quiet and graceful, Serena was electric, uncontainable. the kind of child who seemed to take up more space than her actual body occupied. She hit the ball harder than she should have been able to. She chased every shot with a ferocity that surprised opponents before it delighted them. Have you ever been underestimated simply because someone else in your life received the attention first? Leave a comment below. Because that dynamic, the younger sister always in the shadow of the chosen one, is where the first layer of this story is buried. By the time Serena was 10 years old, Richard Williams had made a decision that the tennis establishment found baffling and slightly insulting. He pulled both daughters out of junior tournaments. In the junior circuit, the pathway to professional tennis, his daughters were already dominant. Serena had won 46 of the 49 tournaments she entered. Richard looked at that record, looked at the world his daughters were winning inside, and saw danger rather than triumph. The junior circuit, he concluded, was predominantly white, politically complex, and socially hostile to his daughters in ways that the trophies could not compensate for. He chose to develop them privately, outside the system, trusting his own plan over the consensus of an industry that had never produced players from anywhere like Compton. The tennis world rolled its eyes. This would come to be a recurring experience. In 1995, Richard Williams moved his family to Florida, to the Rick Machi Tennis Academy, where Machi, one of the most respected development coaches in the country, had agreed after watching both girls play to work with them. Machi later recalled seeing Serena at 10 years old and understanding immediately that what he was witnessing was not ordinary. She had the fastest hands he had ever seen in a junior player, male or female. She hit the ball in ways that violated the logic of technique, because the power she generated made technique almost irrelevant. She was also, Machi noted, deeply emotional on court. She felt every point. She played as if each exchange were a personal conversation. She turned professional at 14. Venus had turned professional at 14 also, and the industry, accustomed to staging the emergence of prodigies on its own terms, found the Williams sisters' arrival difficult to categorize and harder to control. They were too loud, too physical, too uninterested in performing gratitude for spaces the tennis world felt it was generously offering. And beneath every conversation about their games, running like a current no one could quite turn off, was the question the sport had never had to confront in quite this way. What does it mean when two black girls from Compton are better than everyone you have ever produced? The resistance came in forms that ranged from bureaucratic to brutal. Tournaments where crowds cheered Serena's opponents with a fervor that exceeded normal sporting enthusiasm. Press conferences where questions about her body, its size, its musculature, its difference from the slender European standard the sport had always held as the aesthetic ideal, were asked with a clinical detachment that could not entirely disguise the hostility beneath. Opponents who questioned the legitimacy of her achievements. Commentators who, when faced with the gap between Serena's dominance and their expectations, reached for explanations that lived anywhere except her talent. She won the US Open in 1999. She was 17 years old, unseeded, and she defeated Martina Hingis in straight sets. The tennis world had not seen it coming and, more importantly, had not wanted to. The young woman who stood holding that trophy on Arthur Ashe Stadium was not the story the sport had written for itself. She was the interruption of that story. And interruptions of that kind tend to produce complicated reactions. Here is a question worth sitting with. When you arrived somewhere that wasn't built for you, that had its own idea of who belonged, what did it cost you to stay? Drop your answer in the comments, because Serena Williams spent the next 2 decades answering that question with her racket. And the toll it took is the part of this story that the trophy count alone can never tell. The years between 1999 and 2010 produced a career so extraordinary it entered the vocabulary of athletic achievement as its own category. 4 Grand Slam titles between 1999 and 2003. A period of injury and personal darkness in the middle of the decade that the world interpreted as decline, and that turned out instead to be the pause before something even more ferocious. A return in 2007 that began quietly, and then became unstoppable. The development of the Serena Slam, holding all 4 major titles simultaneously, achieved twice over years that no other player in the modern era had managed. But the statistics do not carry what the years themselves carried. In 2003, Serena's older sister Yetunde Price, the eldest of the 5 Williams daughters, the one who drove the girls to practice, who served as the anchor of the family in the years when Richard and Oracines' marriage was fracturing, was shot and killed in Compton. A random act of gang violence. She was 31 years old. Serena was 21. The sister who had been present for everything, who represented the home the family had made before tennis took them elsewhere, was gone in an instant, in the same neighborhood that had produced them, by the same violence that the courts had been their daily practice in avoiding. Serena did not speak publicly about it for years. She played. That was what she knew how to do. She had been taught since she was 4 years old that the court was the place where you put everything. The fear, the anger, the grief, the injustice, and you transformed it into competition. She played, and she struggled, and she played again. The tournaments she lost in that period were framed by the press as evidence of distraction, of lost focus, of a champion fading. They were, in ways the press was not equipped to understand, something far more human. A young woman trying to survive a loss that no racket could address. And then came 2011, and the year that nearly ended everything that injury and loss had not. She had already been dealing with physical consequences that years of elite competition produce invisibly. A cut on her foot, sustained at the US Open in 2010, had required emergency surgery. The surgery led to a blood clot. The blood clot traveled to her lungs. In early 2011, Serena Williams, ranked #1 in the world, owner of 13 Grand Slam titles, the most dominant player of her generation, was hospitalized with a pulmonary embolism. She was 29 years old, in peak athletic condition, and she nearly died. Then, while still recovering from the embolism, she developed a hematoma from a medical procedure. Another emergency. Another surgery. 14 months off the tour while doctors worked to ensure that the body the world had celebrated for its extraordinary capability would simply continue to function. Stop for a moment and consider what that means. The woman who had turned physical dominance into a philosophy of life, who had made her body the instrument through which she expressed everything that language could not hold, lay in a hospital bed while blood pooled in places it should not have been, unable to control the single thing she had always trusted completely: the racket on the nightstand, the courts somewhere outside, and between them, a body that had suddenly become the opponent. She came back. Of course she came back. By 2012, she was winning Wimbledon again. By 2013, she was the undisputed best player on earth, playing tennis of a quality that prompted former champions and coaches to use words they did not usually reach for. Transcendent. Irreplaceable. Once in a century. But 2018 arrived, and with it the moment that crystallized every tension the previous 2 decades had been quietly building toward. The US Open Final. Serena Williams against Naomi Osaka, the 20-year-old Japanese-Haitian player who had grown up idolizing Serena, who had posters of her on the bedroom wall, who had told anyone who asked that the reason she played tennis was because of the woman standing across the net from her now. It should have been a celebration of lineage, of what greatness produces in its wake. Instead, it became the most publicly dissected match in the history of the sport. Chair umpire Carlos Ramos issued a code violation against Serena for what he interpreted as coaching signals from her box. A first violation that Serena denied and disputed with the controlled fury of a woman who had been told, implicitly and explicitly throughout her career, that her perception of her own experience was less reliable than the perception of those observing her. A second violation for smashing her racket. A third for what Ramos interpreted as verbal abuse. Serena's accusation that he had called her a liar, that she would never cheat, that she had a daughter and stood for what was right. The violations cost her a game, and then the match. Osaka won her first Grand Slam title while the crowd booed. Not her, but the circumstances. Osaka wept under her visor. Serena put her arm around her and told the crowd to stop. Even in her own moment of devastating public dispute, the instinct was to protect the young woman who had come after her. What followed was a debate that consumed the sporting world for weeks. Officials who had witnessed male players commit identical or worse violations without receiving equivalent punishment. Data compiled by analysts showing the statistical disparity in how male and female players were penalized for on-court expressions of frustration. Commentators who felt Ramos had been entirely correct. Others who argued that what the crowd had witnessed was the particular tax the sport had always levied on women, and on Serena specifically, who dared to dispute authority with the same directness their male counterparts had always deployed without consequence. Serena said later that she had cried in the locker room for 30 minutes, that she had wanted to boycott the trophy ceremony, that something had broken in her. Not her will, not her love for the game, but her remaining reserve of faith that the system she had operated inside for 20 years would ever see her clearly. What do you do when the institution you have given your life to refuses, even at your greatest moment, to give you the same dignity it gives everyone else? Tell us in the comments, because that question did not have an easy answer in 2018, and it does not have one now. But the deepest crisis was not on any court. It had arrived the year before, in a hospital room in Palm Beach, Florida, where Serena Williams nearly died for the second time in her life. And this time, the cause was the birth of her daughter. She had married Alexis Olympia, the Reddit co-founder, in 2017, in a ceremony in New Orleans that she designed herself because, of course, she did. She was Serena Williams. She did everything herself, completely, on her own terms. She was pregnant during the 2017 Australian Open, the last Grand Slam she would enter before stepping away, and she won it. She was 8 weeks pregnant and she won a Grand Slam title. The number of people who have done anything remotely comparable does not fill a very long list. Olympia was born by emergency C-section on September 1st, 2017. The delivery was difficult, and the hours that followed were more difficult still. Serena, who had experienced pulmonary embolism in 2011 and understood the symptoms, felt something wrong in her body almost immediately. She told the nurse she needed a CT scan and blood thinners. The nurse assumed the pain medication was causing confusion. Serena insisted. She knew what a pulmonary embolism felt like. She had lived it once before. She was not confused. She was right. The CT scan confirmed multiple blood clots in her lungs. Surgery followed to address a hematoma that had opened as a result of the coughing the embolism produced. Then further complications. She spent 6 weeks largely immobile after the birth of her daughter, her body once again the terrain of a crisis she had not chosen. She spoke about it publicly in an interview with Vogue in 2018. Deliberately and specifically, because she understood what her story meant beyond herself. Black women in America die in childbirth at a rate more than 3 times higher than white women. The disparity crosses every line of income and education. It had nearly claimed Serena Williams, one of the most famous, most resourced, most medically informed women on earth, because a nurse had assumed her symptoms were medication-induced confusion rather than what they actually were. She told the story not to generate sympathy, but to ensure that women who would never receive the platform she had could hear themselves in it. Here is something worth pausing on. The woman who had spent her entire life being told that her body was too much, too powerful, too muscular, too present, had discovered in a Florida hospital that when it came to the medical system, her body was simultaneously not believed enough. The same body the sport had celebrated and scrutinized and questioned and tried to contain had nearly been failed by the most fundamental assumption, that she knew what was happening inside it. Think about that. And think about how many women watching this story have felt the same thing in rooms where they were the only one who understood the urgency of what their body was telling them. She returned to tennis. The comeback was extraordinary by any standard but her own. She reached 4 Grand Slam finals between 2018 and 2019, winning none of them. She was the best player on earth not winning the major titles she was playing in, which is either a sentence that makes no sense or the most precise description of what Serena Williams' later career looked like from the outside. Her opponents were younger. Some of them had grown up watching her. And she was still, at 37 and 38 years old, reaching the final stage of every major tournament she entered. The 24th Grand Slam title, the one that would break the all-time record held by Margaret Court, remained elusive. Not because she was not good enough. Because the margin between the best player in the world and the second best player in the world is so narrow that 4 finals in 2 years can produce 4 losses and still represent a performance no other player of her age has approached. The tennis world watched and waited and debated. The commentators who had spent decades explaining that Serena was not quite what she appeared to be, not quite what she claimed, found new ways to maintain that position even as the evidence accumulated against it. She carried it all. The expectations, the record, the debates, the cultural weight that had attached itself to her career so completely that winning a tennis match had long since ceased to be merely about tennis. She carried her daughter in the stands. She carried the memory of Yetunde. She carried the blood clots she had survived twice. She carried the 2018 US Open and everything it had represented. She carried the knowledge that she was black in a sport that had made her feel, in 1,000 small and large ways, that belonging required continuous proof. In August 2022, Serena Williams published an essay in Vogue magazine. She used the word evolution rather than retirement. She was 40 years old. She wrote about wanting more time with her daughter. She wrote about wanting to have another child. She wrote about the grief of leaving, the particular grief of saying goodbye to the version of yourself who existed only on a court. She wrote beautifully and honestly about the impossibility of the choice, about the sport that had given her everything and cost her everything, and about the decision to step toward what she called the next chapter without knowing exactly what the chapter contained. Her last professional match was at the 2022 US Open, the tournament where she had first won at 17, on the court where so much had been decided in her life. She lost in the 3rd round to Ajla Tomiljanovic in a match that lasted over 3 hours, that went to a 3rd set, that required everything she had until everything she had was spent. The crowd roared for her throughout in a way that was less about the match than about the entire weight of what they understood they were witnessing. A 27-year chapter closing in real time. She cried. She told the crowd it had been a fun ride. She thanked them with the grace she had always somehow maintained even when grace was the hardest thing to sustain. And then, she walked off the court. And the silence where Serena Williams used to be settled over the sport like a change in weather. The question no one entirely knew how to ask afterward was the one that she was already living. Who is Serena Williams when Serena Williams is no longer a tennis player? Today, in early 2026, Serena Williams is 43 years old. She lives in Florida and in California with her husband Alexis and their 2 daughters, Olympia, now 8, and Adira, born in 2023, the second child she had spoken of wanting, the one she stepped away from the sport to have the time and the body to pursue. She is a venture capitalist running Serena Ventures. the investment firm she founded that focuses on early-stage companies and has made a particular point of investing in founders from groups, women, people of color, first-generation entrepreneurs, who receive a disproportionately small share of available capital. She is a businesswoman and a mother and a public figure, and in the way that people who have been truly great at one thing always are, a person still navigating the identity that remains when the defining thing is gone. Those close to her describe the adjustment as real and ongoing. The structure of an athletic career, the tournaments, the training cycles, the clear and measurable objectives provides a framework for existence that disappears entirely when the career ends. There is no ranking for motherhood, no scoreboard for venture capital, no moment at the end of a successful week where a crowd stands to acknowledge what you have done. The woman who spent 35 years surrounded by crowds, defined in every room she entered by the extraordinary things she did, is learning what most people learn at a much younger age. Who you are when no one is watching. When the performance is private. When the victory is a toddler saying a new word instead of a trophy held above your head on a sun-drenched court. She has spoken in interviews about missing tennis with a ferocity that surprised her. Not the competition exactly, but the clarity of it. The court was a space where the rules were known, where her authority was expressed directly through her body, where the result of effort was immediate and visible. The world outside the court is murkier, the investments that grow slowly, the children who need a kind of presence that cannot be expressed through power, the mornings without a training schedule when the body that was once the most famous athletic instrument on earth asks, quietly and insistently, what it is for now. Olympia has shown interest in tennis. Of course she has. She has a mother whose face is on the wall at Wimbledon, and a grandmother who swept courts in Compton so that two little girls could practice without cutting their feet. She picks up a racket, and something in Serena's expression, those who have witnessed it say, becomes difficult to describe precisely. Pride and grief and recognition all at once. The particular feeling of watching someone you love stand at the beginning of a road you know every curve of, knowing you cannot walk it for them. And Venus. Venus, who was always first, who is now 45 years old and still playing professional tennis despite a diagnosis of Sjogren's syndrome, the autoimmune disease that has managed her energy and her body for over a decade. The sister who was the original plan, who paved roads for Serena in ways neither of them could have anticipated. Who has never won as many Grand Slam titles and has never seemed to need to, because what Venus Williams carried was never measured in titles. Serena watches her sister still on courts, and feels something that perhaps only younger siblings feel for the ones who arrived first and lit the way. Their father, Richard Williams, the architect of everything, suffered multiple strokes in his later years and lives with the consequences of them. The man who wrote the 78-page plan before his daughters were born, who taught himself tennis from videotapes, who stood on the cracked courts of Compton with a certainty the world called delusion until it was forced to call it vision, is now old in the way that people who have burned at that temperature sometimes become old suddenly and completely. Serena has spoken about him with the complexity that children of complicated parents always carry. Love and gratitude and the unresolved questions that no amount of success can entirely answer. What do you carry from the person who made you possible, when that person was not only extraordinary, but also deeply flawed? Leave your thoughts below, because that question is at the heart of this final section of Serena's story, and it is a question none of us entirely escape. Here is what Serena Williams' story ultimately reveals. Stripped of the trophies and the controversies and the cultural weight that accumulated around her name across 3 decades of dominance. It reveals that greatness at the highest level is never just about talent. It is about what you are willing to endure in order to keep being great. And endurance of that kind leaves marks that trophies cannot cover. It reveals that a woman can be the best in the world at something and still be required daily to prove that the world she dominates is actually hers to be in. It reveals that the body, even the most extraordinary athletic body the sport has ever produced, is ultimately not a machine, not a weapon, not an instrument of dominance, but a human thing that bleeds and clots and requires oxygen and makes demands that cannot be ignored, no matter how inconvenient they are to a schedule or a legacy. It reveals something about what we ask of people we turn into symbols. We asked Serena Williams to be an athlete and an activist and a cultural watershed and a representative of every woman who had ever been told she was too much. We asked her to win while black in a white sport. We asked her to be graceful when the rule book was applied to her differently than to the men beside her. We asked her to lose finals without showing anger, to endure commentary about her body without responding, to carry the weight of systemic injustice into arenas where the only allowed response was to hit a tennis ball harder than anyone had ever hit one before. She did all of it, for nearly 3 decades. And then she made the decision that perhaps required more courage than any of it. She stopped. She chose the private life over the public one. She chose her daughters over the record. She chose evolution, as she called it, over the pursuit of a number, 24, that had followed her through her final years like a shadow. The 24th Grand Slam never came. And what remains without it is this: the most extraordinary tennis player of any generation, who grew up on cracked courts in a neighborhood the sport had never imagined producing her, who survived pulmonary embolisms and near-fatal childbirth and the particular violence of a sport that loved what she could do while questioning whether she belonged, who stood on the largest stages in the world and was visible in ways that changed what visibility meant for everyone who came after her. Naomi Osaka, Coco Gauff, the generation of young black tennis players who grew up watching Serena Williams and understood, because of her, that the courts were theirs. That is not a number on a trophy. That is a legacy that does not fit inside a statistic. She is 43 years old. She is learning who she is without the racket. She is watching her daughters on the floors of their home in Florida. She is making investments in founders the world has underestimated, because she knows from the inside what it looks like when the world underestimates someone who is about to change everything. She is, in the quietest and most important sense, still competing. Just in rooms without cameras now. On courts that have no umpires. Against opponents that cannot be defeated with a forehand, only with the slow, unglamorous work of becoming someone new after you have already been someone extraordinary. If this story reached something in you, if somewhere in Serena's journey you recognized your own fight to belong, your own body that has needed more than you could give it, your own question about who you are when the defining thing is taken away, leave a like as a tribute to a woman still figuring out her next serve. Subscribe so you never miss the stories that matter. And tell us in the comments, what is the one thing Serena Williams' life has proven that no one else's life quite could? Because the greatest lesson she ever taught may not be in any of her 23 titles. It may be this, written not in wins, but in the refusing. That when the world decides who you are allowed to be, the most powerful thing you can do is keep showing up anyway. Especially on the days when everything, your body, the rulebook, the crowd, the record itself, seems determined to tell you that you have already given enough. You haven't. Not until you decide you have. And that decision belongs to no one but you.